Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and to our ongoing study in the new perspective on Paul from an evangelical standpoint from Professor James Dunn in his book, The Theology of Paul the Apostle. We're going to take a look at the second half of his introduction, pages 11 to 23. The first half gave us the summary of the new perspective on Paul. In this half, we get a look at the character of Paul's theology and the task that we face when addressing Paul's theology. Let's go to block 1, the threefold character of Paul's writings. Paul's writings are of a self-revelatory character, and they really are. They are an embodiment of revelation for those of us who have a very high view of Scripture. For those of us who are conservative and evangelical, we have a view of Scripture as revelatory living Word. And so Paul's writings are of a self-revelatory character. They have great revelatory forcefulness, and because of that, we recognize Paul's writings as authoritative. We recognize that they have been commissioned by God through the person of Christ, and that his writings do embody the Evangelion, the gospel, the good news. And it's very obvious that usually Paul's letters are letters in response to some kind of ecclesiastical opposition. We just finished Colossians, where Gnosticism was trying to infiltrate the church in Colossae and in Ephesus. So many times Paul is writing in opposition where he faces some kind of specific opposition. So his letters are confrontational in character. They're directed to a very specific recipient, addressing very specific situations, demanding that we take up good historical first century analysis and try to understand the social nuances as the context within which the letters were written. And we want to discover the line of historical argument. And again, I'll use the example of Colossians. We need to understand the line of historical argument against Gnosticism to truly understand Paul's high Christology and his response in the letter to the Colossians. His letters have a character of a specific rhetorical technique. Paul is very passionate in his treatise of Christ. He's always facing a hermeneutic of suspicion from some opposing group. He has a very genuine existential concern for his recipients. And so it's very passionate revelatory content with a rhetoric of heartfelt existential concern. There's that existential hermeneutic. There's very definitely an existential hermeneutic applied here. We definitely know that. Let's go to block 2, and we take a look at after looking at the character in block 1 of Paul's writings. Now let's take a look at the task, our theological task, of constructing the structure of Paul's theology, the structure behind the content we find in the individual letters. We will write a plot of position. We have a variety of letters. Scholars agree that 7 of those letters are of absolute certain authorship by Paul. There's no argument concerning 7 of those letters. They address a variety of situations, Paul gives us a very depth of theology within that content, and we have to plot the structural position that lies behind the specific content in Paul's letters. So Dunn says our task is a task of structural plotting. We have a task of structural plotting. What kind of a theological structure do we apply to the content in the individual letters? That content we will aggregate into a whole, and then we will articulate the richer structural theology behind that aggregated content. And Dunn says what we will find is a structured Pauline theological consciousness. Our task is to plot a structured Pauline theological consciousness. It will transcend a summation of the content of the letters. It will involve transcendence. We believe in that possibility of transcendence, by the way. We believe in that possibility of transcendence. So our task is one of discovering that structural theological consciousness behind the aggregated holistic content. Block 2, Note 3. We look at the invisible, the fuller theological framework. Behind the letters lies a fuller theological framework. From the visible content, we deduce an invisible theological framework. Therefore, the visible content and the discovered invisible framework will combine to give us a coherent overall picture of Pauline theology. It's content plus structure. And that will give us what? Basically a worldview. It'll give us a worldview. So we're talking about, Dunn's talking about, really, we're trying to form a theological worldview. Our task is to form a theological structured worldview that will involve a combination of visible content and the deduced invisible framework we discover to form a theological coherent picture, all within the tension of the historical confrontation, all within the tension of the historical context. I mean, we just finished Colossians, and in Colossians, we were given the structure of a holistic Pauline Christology. Colossians is Paul's structured holistic Christology. And we could, with effort, we could gather from that content in Colossians a coherent overall Christological structure for Paul's doctrine of Christ. Colossians is Paul's doctrine of Christ. So there's an example that we just finished. And we discovered that Paul's Christology is a very high Christology. And that's a perfect example of what Dunn is talking about here. That it's content plus the framework to form a coherent theological picture within the tension of the historical context, within that tension. Let's move on to block 3 here. and take a look at the fact that Paul's theology was written to counter specific oppositions. Behind the controversy. 1 Corinthians is one such example. We must inquire to the fuller theology behind the controversy with a depth of focus and a width of angle within the historical context and within Paul's larger hermeneutic. And Dunn uses 1 Corinthians as an example, and we can use Colossians as an example, the study we just concluded. Because we did inquire into the fuller theology behind Paul's confrontation with Gnosticism when we did study Colossians. Paul's larger hermeneutic. Dunn says that Paul's theology is a multi-layered theology, framed within a sacred narrative, and here you go, about worldview, within an overall story of God's creation. There you go, within an overall story of a Pauline biblical worldview. So when we discuss Paul's theology, we're constructing Paul's Christocentric, I'm going to say it that way, we will be constructing Paul's Christocentric worldview. Because that's what he has. He has a Christocentric worldview. We discovered that in Colossians, but we will discover that for certain as we go through Dunn's manuscript, I am sure. So I love the fact that Dunn points out that we are going to be looking at an overall story of God's creation, an overall story of a Christocentric worldview. That will be intertwined with the story of Israel. Then Paul will intertwine the story of Christ within the story of creation and the story of Israel. The three narratives will be intertwined together. And it is very much going to be we discussed this in the first half of the introduction, a reevaluation of first century Judaism. For Dunn, we have to look at first century Judaism afresh. We have to examine it in its purity, not with the imprint of Lutheranism, not with the imprint of legalistic Catholicism imprinted over it, but look at it as covenant religion, covenant faithfulness. Look at it in its intended genuine purity. So the entire study will have a very definite refocus on the story of first century Judaism, says Professor James Dunn. And I agree with him. I mean, that's the trend in systematic theology today, is that reexamination of first century Judaism in order to examine afresh the Christocentric theology of the Apostle Paul. And that is going to be our task. It's going to be, to go back to block 2, it's going to be a task of plotting. We're going to examine the visible content and deduce the invisible theological framework that lies behind the content. Content plus the framework will give us a theological, coherent picture of Paul's theology. And that is our task, to grasp and to articulate and to formulate, all within a careful examination of historical context, a theological, coherent picture of Paul's theology. But it will involve transcending